So I'm going to be talking tonight about bringing open source best practices to your day job. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what I see as some of the practices that are emerging in the NPM community as they relate to building open source software. And then I'm going to talk about how they relate to how you could bring them to work with you, how they relate to what big companies are doing as well. As I was introduced, my name is Ben Coe. I'm at Benjamin Coe on Twitter, bco on GitHub. And perhaps an alternate title for this talk would be Open Source, a Love Story, or How I Ended Up Working at NPM. Let me tell you why. As I was introduced, I am employee number 3 at NPM. I'm the manager of our enterprise side of NPM, so I work with the big companies like Walmart and the IBMs of the world to get them running NPM. I started NPM pretty early because NPM was really what got me into open source. It was actually Mark Story in the back introduced me to Node like years and years and years ago, and it became the first open source programming language I worked with. And it was always my hobby thing on the side. And then when I saw NPM formed a company, I immediately got a resume in. I'm also the lead maintainer of Yargs, everyone's favorite pirate-themed command line argument parser. I build NYC, which is a code coverage tool which we use at NPM, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And I manage the enterprise team at NPM. And what I really want to do in this talk is kind of talk about how these two loves kind of can come together, because I really love like enterprise software, but I also really enjoy open source software, and I want to talk about how these two things actually converge, because they sound like fairly different things. So what do I mean by open source best practices? Well, everyone has a process horror story. One of my favorite process horror stories was my first job in Toronto, actually. For migrations, what we would do is we had a wiki that we would edit, and then if we had to do a database migration, we would you go into the wiki, you enter a few paragraphs of text describing kind of what you envision the database would look like after the migration, and then you sit with an ops person and on release day spend an hour shifting your database from one state to another. If you have to roll back the database, it's simple, you just read the wiki backwards from wherever you were. So this was a bad process. Everyone has a crappy story like that, but this doesn't mean process is bad. Siegebot on Twitter is the VP of engineering at NPM. She's awesome. Everyone should follow her. We were talking early on in the history of NPM, the company, and we came to a conclusion. It's pretty simple. Process is very important. Process is what makes you confident to merge a pull request. It's what makes you confident that when you release a new version of your software, you're not going to break everything. But process should be automated. It's from the tedium of repeated tasks that kind of a lot of frustration, I think, comes around processes. And we really study at NPM kind of how can we automate most of the stuff we're doing on a daily basis. And I think open source as a whole moves in that direction as well, because open source is very asynchronous. Like, you're working with someone in Spain or you're working with someone in very different time zones. And you need to find automation around the processes. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail. So, automate all the things. In automation we trust. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the stuff we automate at NPM and some of the trends we see in open source. First off, unit testing. So we use a variety of unit testing tools at NPM. We're not dogmatic about it. We use Mocha, we use Lab, we use Tap. We don't have any standard, really. We basically give people creative freedom in whatever code base they're working in. And we've kind of drank the Kool-Aid of this tiny modules approach where kind of everything we do in NPM, kind of someone starts a module, it's kind of their baby, and they can kind of drive the development on it. In the same regard, we're not dogmatic about process such as TDD. We're not a TDD company. If you think it would make more sense to figure out your algorithm first and then write some tests or whatever, that's fine. But we are dogmatic about rating tests. Like, if you're not rating a test, we're going to bother you. We're going to say, you should probably write a test here. In this regard, everything that we do on NPM runs through Travis CI, and we can see without someone having to notice that the build failed, we're going to get these automated build failing and passes badges on our projects, which is really nice. Other process that we've automated, test coverage. Test coverage, I mean, everyone has mixed opinions about test coverage. Do you try to get 100% test coverage? Do you not? I think test coverage is very important, and we've come to rely on it at work because it eliminates the question, especially in open source, it eliminates the question, please write a test. So if you've ever maintained an open source project, someone comes in, they have like this slick new feature that they want to land, and like as an open source maintainer, you end up spending 90% of your time going to people and saying, could you please write a test for this? Could you please write a test for this? And it just gets frustrating after time. The beautiful thing about being strident about adding test coverage into your project is you start to eliminate this nagging behavior. And you can automate this process. We use a tool called coveralls, which is going to alert you whether or not your test coverage has dropped below a given threshold. And it just helps in the maintenance of your open source and your closed source projects. This is the NYC tool that I wrote. I think one of people's main objections to test coverage is that it's kind of a hassle. Like if you're using Mocha or whatever, you have to pass it 37 different command line arguments to Istanbul to actually instrument your suite. Isaac and I made this tool NYC, and what it does is at the low level, it wraps your require statement, and it also wraps your child processes. So at the end of the day, without you needing to know a thing, you just put the word NYC in front of whatever test runner you're running. So you can go NYC Mocha or NYC Tap or NYC Ava, and it will just start giving test coverage to everything. And that works kind of at the low level, but it abstracts kind of the objection of it being complicated from adding test coverage. So strong advocate of test coverage, try it out. And I think you'll find that it means you don't nag people as much on your open source projects. This is definitely the most controversial of the things I'm going to advocate automating. Me and CJ, I remember about 2 years ago, we literally it was the one time we almost actually got in a fist fight, was over coding style. And I think everyone's worked at a company where you submit a pull request and you've got some cool new feature, and you probably should have this really good discussion around whether this feature should be built, what needs to be done with it. But the pull request kind of devolves into, you're missing a semicolon here, you need a parentheses here, you need a single quote, or we're a double quote company. And this is just silly. Like I think that any time that you're finding yourself arguing about semicolons or quotation, this is not programming. This is something a robot can do for you. Ultimately, what we decided at NPM was that we don't want to be dogmatic about coding style. We want people to be creative. We want them to use the tools they want to use, like I was talking about with the test coverage, the unit testing suites. So we want people to be creative. At the same time, if I rate a code base or CJ rates a code base, we want to force other people who come into that code base to adhere to that style. So what we ultimately decided on is pick whatever coding style you want, but automatically enforce the coding style. So not only have a linter, but automatically run the linter so that a pull request actually just gets rejected by a robot if you've missed lint. One of my favorite projects that's around right now is Feroce's standard library. And this basically is just this simple off-the-shelf linter that's very, very opinionated. And I just throw it as a pre-test script in all of my programs, and it will literally just break the build if you break the style. And then if someone comes in and they're like, I want semicolons, or I want single quotes, or I want double quotes, or whatever, I say, not my problem, go talk to Feroce at standard and open an issue up with him, because this is not a code base about semicolons. So I recommend that behavior to everyone. Another important thing that I think a lot of people overlook is the importance of keeping dependencies up to date, and it's kind of a frustrating chore. By this I mean the longer you wait to upgrade something, the more annoying it becomes. So if I just get my code base running and I'm on version 2.0.0 of something, and then the next day 3.0 comes out, it's really frustrating to be forced to do the update, and it's very natural as a software developer to kind of wait a year. But now guess what? It's at version 5 in a year, and it's going to be even more frustrating to update your dependency. I've really found that just being strident about updating your dependencies is the right way to go. And if you have trouble updating your dependencies, just get involved in open source and help them figure out why their thing broke your build and help them fix it. NPM has a command, npm outdated, which you can use to see what's kind of out of date in your packages, and you should run that frequently. But even so, I still find that I don't run it often enough that I keep my code bases up to date. You kind of, even if you tell yourself, okay, I'm going to run npm outdated occasionally, you get lazy and you stop doing it. So there's this really neat thing called Greenkeeper. And what Greenkeeper is, it's just this robot that you hook up and point it at your open source project, or your closed source project now, actually. And it will just run around, and as soon as one of your dependencies updates to a new version, it will just automatically create the GitHub pull request for you, give you a thorough description of why this update happened, and kick off your unit tests, kick off everything, and you'll kind of have a confidence that this didn't break your build, or did break your build, and you have to fix something. So, without having to do that maintenance yourself, it will do it for you. It's really useful. Greenkeeper.io. this probably isn't too shocking, but we're also NPM power users at NPM. So there's a lot of commands built into NPM that are kind of designed just for open source project management and for running your project in an effective way. I just wanted to outline some of my favorites. Not many people know about this. If you've ever published an NPM module and you type in npm publish, it's actually publishing to the latest tag. So there's this concept of tags in NPM. And the latest tag is what you get if you just type npm install. So if I npm publish foo and don't do anything, and then npm install foo, I'm actually getting foo at latest, which is going to be whatever it was. You can actually choose to publish as a different tag. So if you're working on an open source project, you land a feature request that you're a little bit frightened about. Maybe it's going to push you from 3.0 to 4.0 of your library or something. But you want to land it, you're ready to move forward. Great thing to do is you can publish with the tag alpha, or beta, or whatever, it can banana. And then what you can do is you can go to people in your open source project and you can say, hey, npm install foo package at banana, and try it out, let me know if it's working. The whole community that's relying on your module is going to continue getting the latest tag, so you haven't broken anything. But it's a much easier way to kind of have a staggered release process where you can let people actually try out the stuff before you go live. Really useful. Another favorite feature that's just doesn't do that much, but you should try it, is semantic versioning is baked right into NPM. So if you're going to release a patch release or a minor release or a major release, you can just type in npm version patch, minor or major, and give it a commit message. That will create a tag in your Git branch that will create, it will increment the number in your package.json, create a tag with that number in your Git repository, and then you can just push it up to GitHub and then type npm publish, and that whole process will work for you. Other thing we do at NPM is we use private modules for a lot of stuff. So like I said, we drink our own Kool-Aid. We internally, if we have something that's proprietary code, we still write it as you would write open source JavaScript code, where we slice it into a lot of modules. People have varied responsibility, but we publish this stuff to a few private NPMs internally. One interesting one that's worth talking about is if NPM just literally a bomb went off at I don't know, Amazon East today and all of our servers went down, you can install npm from another npm registry that we run elsewhere. So that's one of our internal npms, is just a complete copy of npm. So the theme of this whole kind of talk about open source practices so far has been basically automate things. It's really good to automate things, and I'm speaking more now as an open source maintainer than an employee of npm. It is that engineers are far more tolerable of a pedantic robot than they are of pedantic people. And this is so true. If you're that maintainer who's running around saying, please write a test, please write a test, please write a test, or test coverage dropped, I mean, suddenly you're an asshole in 6 months, and people think you're man, what a annoying maintainer. But if you have a robot doing it for you, people are like, oh man, Ben's a nice guy. meanwhile they're rating tests all the time. It's great. Good social engineering. But what I would like to say though is these best practices. It's not that people don't just one day walk in and start writing JavaScript with test coverage or start using the standard library or whatever. These practices come out of the community. They don't grow in a vacuum. And I want to talk about kind of how these practices tend to spread. So NPM is getting to the point where it's a huge community. We have about 190,000 people publishing packages. There's, as I think Darcy implied, there's about 250,000 packages that have been published to NPM, which is nuts, because when I started, there was I don't know, 80,000 maybe? It's like we're kind of seeing exponential growth on every curve. About 3.5 million JavaScript developers install JavaScript on a monthly basis from NPM, so it's a big user base. Anyone want to guess how many things are installed from NPM on a monthly basis? Because it's a really big number. It's pushing... So 3.8 billion almost installs a month. It's nuts. That's actually one of our big costs as a company, is just keeping up with all those installs. So, long story short, in such a kind of so much noise, or so much signal noise ratio, how do these good practices actually spread across the community and become best open source practices? Well, I'm going to pick out unit testing as an example, because I think everyone who ever goes to conferences or goes to meetups like this, they know that 5-6 years ago, it was kind of controversial. Everyone was giving talks about how you should unit test, how you should do TDD, how testing was important. And this came out of developers who were running these large-scale projects with tools like GitHub becoming popular, where you suddenly have this huge community collaborating on a project at the same time. It was getting to the point where it was very hard for people to effectively maintain projects unless they had tests that gave them confidence that they weren't breaking things. So through these talks and through people evangelizing unit tests, you saw unit testing spread across the community to the point where, today if I'm evaluating a JavaScript library I'm going to use, it's a pretty big strike against it if there's no unit tests written for it. I'd like to take this a step further and kind of talk about, what does it take to be one of the, if I look at the top 100 most popular projects on NPM, kind of what are some of the things that they have in common? What I would say is people emulate the projects that they respect, and this creates a really interesting feedback loop. So what I mean by this is, so if I want to today rate a really popular module that, 1 million people are using, how can I do that? Well, what works best is studying the projects of other maintainers already on the list of popular maintainers, interacting with the developers, so actually talking to them, learning what they're doing, learning from them, like I said, and emulating their methodology. So what I mean by a feedback loop is, if I go to the top 100 projects, you're going to see a lot of similarities across the top 100 projects, and it's hard to say, did any one person start that methodology? Not really. It kind of just starts to propagate. A really good example of this is this concept of badges. No one came down with clay tablets from a mountain and said, you're going to put badges on the top of your README, and they're going to tell me kind of the state of your project. This was something that grew completely out of the community, where people were like, oh, I should put a build badge on top of my project. And then gradually you got more and more badges as the community came up with more and more things you can do. And now you can have a unicorn approved project. You can have coding standards can be in your repo. There's all these things, and it's become this great indicator of quality in open source, is this badge things. And it's really cool because it's just one of these things you see grow out a community. I'm not going to do that again. What I'd like to say, though, is it's not just kind of coding practices and libraries that propagate across the community. I'd say best practices center around great tools, and great tools grow up around best practices. So let me talk to you about what I mean about this. So let's look at the top 10 packages on NPM. And I have a Canadian Octocat there for everyone. So 10 out of 10 of the top projects on NPM all use GitHub. About 9 out of 10 have Travis CI wired up for continuous integration. And about 3 out of 10 use the coveralls for keeping their coverage stats up to date. So you start to see these kind of tools that people kind of converge on. And so good tools kind of grow around good practices. So I kind of want to talk to you about kind of the dream workflow that I see when I'm working on open source stuff on NPM. It's basically a pull request is open on GitHub. Now, as a result of this pull request being open on GitHub, you're going to do a bunch of automated robotic things like I was talking about. So you're going to be kicking off your Travis builds. You're going to be reporting information to your to your code coverage server. You're going to be installing stuff from your public and private registries. And so you've got all these automated things going on. And at the same time, you've started a conversation with other developers on the project. So people are coming in, and in a perfect world, people are starting conversations around the semantics of the pull request. They're not starting a conversation around whether you have a semicolon or whether you have a quote. They're talking about, does this add a feature we need? Does this have the API service we need? So you've got kind of robotic things off to one side and semantic human things off to the other side. So the pull request is kept up to date. So with the GitHub API now, you'll see those nice green bars and red bars on your pull request to keep you apprised of how all that stuff's going. Then what's going to happen is I'm going to merge this module. I'm going to publish it up to NPM, maybe on an alpha tag. Maybe I'm publishing up to latest. And then that cool Greenkeeper thing I told you, what's so neat about this is as I start to wire this up to dozens and dozens of projects that are dependent, we now automatically start this kind of repetitive process where now there's 30 projects that need to be updated with this new library version. So it's this nice feedback loop. It's really cool. So what actually allows this really slick workflow to work? Well, it's that we have these really slick tools that work well together. We have GitHub, which is kind of become the de facto way people collaborate on code. We have great tools like Travis that, at this point, you can run almost any database on them. You can run anything in CI. And it lets humans do what humans are good at, and it lets computers do what computers are good at, which I think is an important point. And what's important to me as a giant nerd is it also does feel a little bit like you're controlling this giant robot army. You've got these like CI servers off on the right, and you've got this other stuff over here, and it's kind of this fun, slick workflow. So I think this is a very good question. Up to this point, I've been talking a little bit about, kind of what I see as open source practices, how I see them propagating across NPM. So if I'm so passionate about open source, why do I run the enterprise team at NPM? Why do I like working with these giant companies like Walmart and Intuit? Let me talk a little bit about that. Developing enterprise software is very hard. Does anyone here work at anyone here work for fairly large firms or large like IBM or mostly smaller firms? Okay. Well, I'll speak on behalf of these giant firms. Developing enterprise software is very hard. There's restrictions on your infrastructure. So as a developer, we kind of take for granted now that I can just go on Amazon and I can spin up a little AMI and I can be testing out my proof of concept. If I work at, giant company foo, I can't do that. I have to talk to an ops person. I have to go through some sort of OPSEC review to actually get a server. And the server I get is probably 15 years old. So it's hard. As a result, I think, of some of this difficulty, the practices inside enterprises tend to lag behind open source. So the best practices I was just discussing don't find their way into large enterprises as fast. And this can be very overwhelming for the developers inside these large enterprises. So even though they have 400 really smart developers working for them, the process can become very overwhelming to actually move code forward and to actually build cool things. But these are smart people who I think can be enabled. And what I would say is I think these same open source methodologies can work really well inside the enterprises. Open source practices grew up in these large asynchronous communities like building the Linux kernel, where you have to support these teams that are spread out across time zones, different skill levels. This is true of modern large corporations because you're going to have remote workers, you're going to have people who work in 5 different time zones. These same practices that work really well for giant open source projects can work very well inside large corporations. PayPal has coined this term inner source for this concept of applying these open source methodologies inside of large companies. And just want to read you a quote from PayPal's experience. And it was basically, the results were visible after 6 months. The checkout platform team spends 0% of its time rewriting code and just 10% of their time reviewing submissions. The team was able to do a major refactoring and a 4 times increase in performance without planning for it. And that's an interesting one for me because free 4 times performance, I've never been on an engineering team where that happens. I don't know if I believe it, but this is, I think, the most interesting thing is the mindset moved from blocking change to mentoring and coaching. And I think this speaks very much to what open source has grown up in and why I love open source software that's kind of the heart of open source right there. These practices are built around the concept of mentoring. They're built around unblocking people. And I think it's very exciting that you could start to bring these processes in to work with you to make work as nice of an environment as I find open source can be. And there's a giant caveat attached to that we can discuss later, because open source isn't always very nice. So education is very important. Inner source is about developers taking ownership of repos. So kind of like I talked about at NPM, where we treat our internal software development of private stuff similarly to how you would treat open source development. You kind of make many modules, give people creative freedom to build them the way they want, but also encourage them to take ownership of them. You basically are saying that if I write module X at company Y, I am now the lead maintainer of that module. I need to make sure that pull requests are getting landed on it. I need to make sure that it moves forward effectively. So I'm taking on that responsibility. And kind of to allow developers to take on this responsibility, you need to empower the developers. And how am I doing for time, Taz? Can I?
Yeah, you can take like 10 more minutes.
Okay. Am I at 30 already? Am I at 10, 20?
You have like 5 more minutes to get to 30. And,
okay, cool. I'm going to give so I guess what I was going to say, though, is this, by what I mean empowering developers, is I do a lot of enterprise software sales. So I'm like 50% salesperson and about 50% software developer at this point in my career. And you go into a company that's spent, $800,000 on every floor of their building, so they have like a Monopoly-themed floor and like a Mario Brothers-themed floor, but they won't spend like $15,000 to get GitHub Enterprise for their developers, or to get these tools that developers actually want to work with. So that's kind of what I'm evangelizing. Like, give your developers the tools they need to do their job properly, and they probably are fine if you skip that video game-themed floor of the office. So the tool I wanted to demo really quickly tonight was NPM Enterprise, which is what I work on. I'm just going to pop it open here. So this is what I've been working on, and this is really what the first thing I really built at NPM, and this is kind of iteration X of it. But basically, NPM Enterprise lets you run the exact same code base that does 3.5 billion installs a month inside Docker containers on whatever server you can find kicking around. So really cool. But it's got all these kind of, like, you can plug in basically your existing enterprisey stuff here. So, you can plug in GitHub Enterprise, or you can plug in SAML, or you can plug in whatever. But at the end of the day,
Can you zoom in? Make your phone bigger?
Yeah, sure. So this is like your control panel. So this is basically just controlling a ton of Docker containers, which make up NPM Enterprise. I'm going to plug in, so for this demo, I've plugged in GitHub Enterprise, which I'll show you as well. And at the end of the day, what you end up with is just your own URL for your own NPM registry up here that works exactly the same as the regular NPM. So let me show you some of these tools working together. So I've created a private NPM module here. And you just NPM login like you would a regular registry, but you give it your private registry, and you give it the scope that you're going to use for your company. So for this little demo, I'm going to make a company I call InnerSource Tools to show these things working together. And then I'm going to log in with my GitHub Enterprise credentials, because that's why I plugged into it. So there we go. So I've logged into my private NPM. And then the cool thing is I basically develop my private modules exactly the same as exactly the same as I would develop public modules. So here is a private NPM module. The main difference you're going to see is I logged in with InnerSource Tools as my fake company. My module name is just going to have that same prefix. So that's how we kind of decide where the heck we should publish this to. And the other thing you're going to see is I have a link pointing to my GitHub Enterprise. So I just have that in the meta information. So suppose I come along and I'm working for giant company foo. I've got all these enterprise tools running like GitHub Enterprise, NPM Enterprise. How do I actually create a pull request and build something? So in this little demo module here, it basically just prints out the word hello if we look at this code. So suppose I just want to create a new feature for this module. So I'm going to make a new feature. I'm going to say, I want to actually print out the word goodbye as well. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to be kind of a bad developer here. I'm not going to rate any unit tests. I'm not going to see if my code actually runs or anything, because I want to show you exactly how this gets caught by all these robots I'm running. So I'm going to just exactly the same as your open source workflow. So I'm going to create a branch called add goodbye. See what's actually changed. I've added that method. So there we go. So now I'm going to push that up to my GitHub Enterprise. Come around here to my Chrome. So here we go. So the nice thing is if you're using GitHub Enterprise in your tool chain as well, it's exactly the same as when you're playing with public GitHub. Like the UI is exactly the same, the experience is exactly the same. So I just create a pull request. I'm adding this new goodbye method. And it sounds good. I'm going to create that pull request. Now, here's all these automated processes that are kicking off, like I was talking about earlier in the talk. So what's going to happen here is, developers can come in and they can say, should I actually have, is this API actually good? Like, why do you have the method goodbye just chained on to hello? Maybe someone's going to push back on that. You can have a discussion about whether this looks like good code. But at the same time, you have all these automated processes that are kicking off, like Travis. So we can see here, so neat thing about Travis here, if I scroll down to the npm install here, let's see here. There we are. It's actually installing this module for my own private npm, which is cool. So Travis doesn't really know the difference. It's just installing my private module. And then we have that, if I scroll down here, we have my NYC running here that I was talking about earlier. You see that I'm literally just running NYC mocha test.js. So I have test coverage in here. And if I go back to the pull request now, let's take a look here. If I go back to the main page, pop open the coverage. There we go. So we see that my coverage actually dropped a few percent because I didn't bother writing a test for that. So what's going to happen if the demo actually finishes is it's going to come back and say, hey, you can't land this yet. You've dropped your test coverage. So you've got this kind of nice automated workflow around all the exact same tools that you play with in open source, which I think is really cool. So at that point, I come back, I write some unit tests, life is good. Let's go here. Oh, there we go. It did eventually fail. So you see that without a developer having to come in and tell me, please write a test for this crazy new function, we see that we've looped in and we've updated this and kind of we've done that. So I write a test. Oh, let's actually write a test if I've got a minute. So, okay, fine. No developer has to come yell at me. Okay, and I'll be less lazy and actually run my unit test now. So we see that I actually get the test coverage up to 100%. Oh, that's not how you type. There we go. So there we go. Without another person on the team getting frustrated at me, this robot looped in, told me what's going on, kept me apprised of kind of the whole process. And at the end of the day, I'm just going to merge that because I know it's going to pass. But this is where kind of your private NPM comes in, because what I can do now is I can go to the command line, go back to my master branch, pull that change I just did, and then I'm going to use that NPM feature I told you about where I can just go NPM version. And does anyone here know semantic versioning? We can talk about that in a bit, but does anyone have a guess of should this be a minor patch or?
That's a minor.
Minor, cool. You're all right. So you all get a point. Which you can collect after the talk. So I'm adding a new minor patch there. So what that's going to do is going to automatically create the tag. It's going to increment my package.json. So I can push up the So I can push up the change to the package.json, push the tags up. So if I go up to my GitHub Enterprise now, we're going to see that we have a new release there for version 1630. And then at the end of the day, I can just npm publish, and let me show you what that means exactly. So it was smart from our initial login to see that inner source tool should be going to our private npm. So if I go back to my private npm here, we actually have our own version of the npm website that you can run to do your own internal development. So you end up with this knowledge base where you can see what people are publishing inside your company. It looks exactly the same as regular npm. So we can see this is a private module I just published. Everything works exactly the same if you've ever been to the npm website. The nice thing is it also links to your other private internal tools. So that's the end of the demo. Let me go back to my slides here. And let's go. Do I want a new window? I don't want to present from beginning. How did I do that? All right. None of those were the options I wanted. Where were we? There we go. So this kind of now a bit more of the sales pitchy side of things is like, as an open source developer, I don't have to go out and shop for some cheaper version of the stuff I use. I just use GitHub because it's the best, but it's free usually. Same goes for Travis CI and a lot of these other tools. When you get into a company and you're actually spending money for stuff, I mean, there's cost benefit analysis to actually throw down the money for stuff. But I've been working very closely with GitHub and Travis and coveralls and npm to just make the tools work together very well, because we're a small company, we can only work with so many people, and we're trying to kind of work with the ones that people are using in open source to bring them into your workplace. What does it mean to be working with these companies? Well, npm is keeping our roadmaps aligned, so we're trying to basically make it so Travis and npm are more closely attached, GitHub and npm are more closely attached. You can eventually buy them together. And we're also preaching a very similar message about kind of open source in the enterprise. Like, take these open source practices that are working for these giant open source projects and use them to make your software development inside your company more efficient. And what I would say is open source software and enterprise software can learn a lot from each other, and this is why I enjoy doing both, because yes, like maybe enterprise software development seems a little archaic and it's not using all the same cool tools and whatever, but it's a company making billions of dollars a year because their startup is now a giant company that was successful. So it's like you can learn a lot from their business practices, you can learn a lot from the methodologies they have developed internally, and I think bring them closer together. And I think that if there's one thing that makes me enjoy my job, it's that on a day-to-day basis I can make developers' lives better. And I think that a big part of that isn't just making open source developers' lives better, it's making people who are working in some dinosaur of an old company's lives much better too. And it's very important to me. I'm not going to ask any questions because I have to wait until the panel, so ignore that line there. But again, my name is Ben Coe, and I'm github.com/bco. So thank you so much for your time.